Thank you, Madam Vice President, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates. As a representative, a member of the CEDAW committee, and also I am Vice Chair of the Working Group on Gender-Based Violence Against Women in the committee, I would like to just introduce some highlights from the work of the committee on this important issue on gender-based violence, including economic violence. The CEDAW Convention is the main source of universal standards concerning women's rights to equality, but also women's identity, autonomy, economic independence, and empowerment. The Convention includes clear obligations of the state parties towards this end, including combating gender stereotyping, as it was mentioned. And the 189 countries which ratified the Convention also recognize the Convention and the competence of the Committee to have a strong focus on the elimination and on protection against violence against women globally. And the Committee, through its main methods of work, the constructive dialogue and issuing concluding observations, and also under the optional protocol, monitors the observance of these obligations of the state. Concerning the optional protocol, I would just mention that out of 55 cases decided with violation by the state parties, almost 30 are related to gender-based violence, and almost all inquiries conducted until now, and with reports, 7 reports contain recommendations also concerning gender-based violence, including economic violence. The General Recommendation 35 from 2017, updating on gender-based violence, General Recommendation 19, recognizes that the opinion juris and state practice suggests that the prohibition of gender-based violence against women has evolved into a principle of customary international law, and it is respected by the state parties because we observe the application of the Convention and we monitor through the reports of the state compliance of the state parties also on gender-based violence. Also, it contains economic violence against women and girls. And what is most important is that from the practice that emerges from the practice of the committee under the Convention in the last years, in the increased importance of the application of the principle of intersectionality and protection of women and girls in all situations and in specific situations of vulnerabilities. And it has increased importance in cases especially of economic violence already mentioned, where intersectionality plays directly in the nature, severity and violence, and also possibilities for exiting of women and girls from violence. So economic violence is gender-based violence specifically, and if we focus in the private sphere where it begins, it's gender-based violence and violence against women which represent coercive control, coercive limitation of personal life, of human rights of women, of their individual freedom in the economic sphere. And without having an explicit definition, as I said, the Convention and the practice of the committee show that it has been identified and monitored by the committee also in the obligations of the state parties. The economic violence has implications, according to our practice, also on vulnerability of women to other forms of gender-based violence. It impacts their economic independence, economic security and possibilities, their right to equal pay, but also economic violence affects women's choices, access to their rights, the rights to health and reproductive rights, especially not in some countries where there are restrictions, they are not available for women deprived, for example, the reproductive rights services. But also economic violence impairs the access to justice and to political participation of women. So what is, I think, very important to give some example of the protection from economic violence. It is in the recommendations of the committee to the state parties and in the practice under the optional protocol, where we understand for example, domestic violence as intimate partner violence in marriage between former spouses, in intimate partnerships between cohabitants and former cohabitants, so very broadly. And also we regard domestic violence according to our practice as a pattern of behavior in the form of psychological, emotional, physical violence, but also economic violence, and also in the most extreme cases after stalking, serious physical injuries resulting also in death of the women and of their children. I will give here the example, for example, the case Promolex versus Moldova, where it is femicide case because it's death resulting from serious injuries inflicted to the woman, and she was disabled and dependent. Also, in the case González Carreño, very well known versus Spain, we have the killing of the child, but also the woman and the child were in situation also of economic violence. And domestic violence, also in economic violence, including non-payment of child support, as already mentioned by my colleague, and we have it in the practice, and establishing forced contact, traumatizing, and committing acts of violence against children during visitations is the case, for example, SL versus Bulgaria. Also, in one case, KEL versus Canada, economic violence was specifically addressed, and I will mention the recommendation. So all the provisions of the Convention are involved in protection from gender-based violence and economic violence, Article 2 and 3, the core obligations, Article 5 against stereotyping, Article 11 all on economic equality and employment, economic employment and sexual harassment, Article 13 on empowerment, economic empowerment of women, Article 15 equality before the law, and Article 16 equality in marriage. So measures recommended by the committee. Adoption of appropriate legislation and adherence to international regional standards on gender equality with clear definitions, including also we recommend the ratification and implementation where needed of the Istanbul Convention. Also the need for urgent joint protection of women and children in the best interests of the child, and also because we know economic violence affects children and women, and they are manipulated through economic violence, non-payment of maintenance, and also by other means of threats. And in these cases, we recommend that the aliments, the maintenance should be paid, insured by the state. In the case, for example, I will say, speaking about intersectionality, KEL versus Canada, the committee recommended recruiting and training more Aboriginal women to provide legal aid and reviewing the legal aid system in order to help also women, Aboriginal women in situations of violence. And also ensure especially assistance of women and children to specialized services, very important, and ensuring legal aid, as I said, but also ensuring, for example, assistance through specific translator or language translation when it's needed in cases of disabled women, and in cases of sign language translation is needed, like in RPB case versus the Philippines, a minor girl who was raped. Because it's also very important, I would like to say, support for non-governmental organizations who can be, these organizations can be really give impetus for women to protect their rights, and they work against the exacerbation of violence, including economic violence, by offering support. This is very important because we found that the inadequate protection through availability and accessibility of specialized services for victims of violence, including through women's organizations, was found to be in direct causal relationship with the violence suffered by women. And we further in our recommendations, just I would like to finish with that, we in all our recommendations during the monitoring process and in the concluding observations, they are all in the direction also against gender-based violence and economic violence by recommending measures for the economic independence, for the education of girls and of women, continuous education of women, and also specifically of women and girls and women in unions related to harmful practices, including child and forced marriage, polygamy, and abduction of women for forced marriage. We have concrete cases, also inquiries concerning that, where these issues are addressed, like the inquiry against for abduction of women and girls, Kyrgyzstan, the inquiry concerning Kyrgyzstan, and also the inquiry concerning South Africa, where these intersectionalities are also addressed. Thank you.